Okay, so we're going to get started. This is the last little section tying up mood and emotions before we venture into attachment theory next class, and we have the reading break next week. So we're going to recap just a few things just to kind of keep it fresh in our mind and see how we build on these different components. We'll talk about being in the world again and how that relates to mood and emotion. So again, the idea is that the way of being of a person is such that we are always already in the world. There's not this self-sufficient kind of mind, subject, consciousness, independent of a world that we have to somehow then explain how it comes into contact with the world. We have that mode of being, or that representational way of taking up a detached stance as it relates to our situation, but by and large we are, just immersed within the world and particular practices and ways of engaging with people and things. So again, we're not a self-sufficient subject separate from the world. Dasein, the way of being of persons, is such that it dwells within a referential totality, a totality of ready-to-hand equipment such as hammers and pencils and cars and doors and all kinds of things that we just readily engage with somewhat unthinkingly. Our practices and our sort of know-how recedes into the background as we engage in other kinds of tasks that may be explicit, but they may be just like a pre-thematic understanding or way of engaging with people or with things. Part of that totality involves signs that has the character of showing or indicating as it relates to our concern in the context of our social activity, and also shared practices that involve language, that we dwell within a symbolic language, and various artifacts that have symbolic value as it relates to a particular culture. And again, the emphasis is that much of this is a sort of a tacit understanding. It's a background familiarity in terms of it's operating in the background of our perception. It's not necessarily operating on a mechanistic level. And it can be brought to awareness primarily through breakdown of various sorts, is how this stuff kind of lights up or becomes aware. So on the basis of this pre-thematized background familiarity, pre-thematized means preconceptual, precognitive, it's just this intuitive understanding or intuitive familiarity, entities and actions through affordances in the environment show up as intelligible, that is meaningful or possible or worth doing in given contexts. And this structures how we comport ourselves, how we direct ourselves toward various things and people and entities in the world, and the practical activities that constitute our everyday circumspective concern. So again, circumspection is just the taking up and engaging in various activities somewhat unthinkingly as it relates to some practical goal or activity. So again, as we talked about, much of everyday Dasein, so average everyday Dasein, average everyday way of navigating the world as a person, is inauthentic or unchosen. So it's inauthentic in that you're kind of, again, thrown into this world with various artifacts and meanings and practices and so on, and you don't usually think about these things unless there's some kind of problem, right? So again, the example of the proximity, with which you can, be with someone, engage in a conversation comfortably. That's not something that you learn as an explicit rule or belief. It's not taught to you in that way, and you only realize that it is sort of an intuitive, familiar understanding when you encounter maybe other people who are, intruding up into your space or what feels comfortable, or they're standing at a distance that feels a little bit odd. Moods or emotions, as we talked about here last time, are holistic phenomena. So we're kind of working from this 5-point model, suggesting that each of these components, be it what's operating on a neurobiological level, what's operating in terms of our behavior, our cognitive interpretation, the various sociocultural practices that may structure how an emotion and when an emotion shows up, display rules, things like that, and the phenomenological, just what it's like to experience a given mood or emotion, all of these things hang together as a holistic phenomenon. And one way to kind of get this clear in your head is that each of these different components, they're arguably necessary components, but on their own, they lack sufficiency. They're insufficient on their own. So again, it's this a holistic thing that we're trying to account for. We talked about situatedness as, again, one of these existentials, which is a category that applies to, the way of being of Dasein. So again, some of the other existentials that we've talked about already in this class, we've talked about temporality, our capacity to sort of exist in a lived time, that we have this ability to retain what was and anticipate, future possibilities. We have a sense of existential space, that we direct ourselves within our attention, in a sort of lived space. And situatedness is, it's that we always find ourselves already in a situation and way of being attuned to the world, where things, people, and ways of acting are disclosed as mattering. So it's a way of attunement, or a way of being kind of dialed into the world. And this is, if you're a human being, you have this capacity. And a concrete manifestation, how this shows up is concretely through moods, through different kinds of moods, is what we talked about here last time. So the idea is that we are always in a mood. Moods are not things in us, like in our heads or something like that, in some subjective inner world or something. And we are never not in a mood, right? So there's always, even the moods that we barely recognize. So a mild anticipation, an apprehension, a contentment even is a kind of mood. A disappointment, just a restlessness or an uneasiness. And it's kind of like an atmosphere or a climate that you're sort of dwelling within. Or it's a frequency or a way of being dialed into the world or attuned to the world in a particular way. In terms of how it relates to the things that matter, you can think about it in terms of like a compass that sort of orients you in a particular way, in a particular direction, such that things can show up and disclose themselves in a certain light. And moods arguably allow us to do that, and emotions are more specific manifestations that are built atop moods that have a sort of directionality to them. So moods and emotions can disclose the world. They can open us up to particular ways of engaging the world and other people, or close us off in particular ways. So a mood of irritability can open us up to the possibility of conflict, of reckoning with other people. It can open up the possibility of the emotion of anger showing up as it relates to a specific individual. It simultaneously closes us off from the possibility of being vulnerable or allowing someone to connect with us in a more intimate way. And moods are always experienced within the larger social context. That is, in relation to friends, in relation to family, colleagues, social groups, society, culture, politics, history, all of that. So there's this sort of meaningful referential whole within which these moods and emotions are structured. Okay, so that's more or less a recap. There's a few things that we didn't get time to talk about that I thought would be good to mention here. So again, we can think about how a therapist might make use of some of this, or how a therapist might work with a client. And we might wonder, well, how is this person situated within their average everyday way of being in the world? How does their mode of being influence their receptivity to meaning, to people, and to other kinds of moods and emotions? So rather than just attending to, how does this person habitually think? How do they interpret their situation and so on? We're kind of attending to, how is this person dialed into the world? And part of it is what is it like to be in the room with this person? How do you find yourself kind of responding in a way to this person? Can that give you a sense of, the mood-based disposition that is familiar to this individual? So, and remember, you're always in a mood of some sort, so the goal of therapy is, if part of the problem that the client is wanting to resolve is resolving some mood or some way of, relating to people. You're trying to work them from a particular mood into another kind of mood. So you might wonder, okay, so a person who has the character of irritability, like they're amped up, and it's almost like you get a sense that there could be the possibility of conflict right around the corner if you approach this person in the wrong way that maybe sets them off. And so, and again, a particular mood, discloses the world in a particular way. So a person who is constantly in this state of chronic irritability and defensiveness and, ready to take offense and whatnot, like they see the world arguably as threatening, as something that they need to, be on guard against, as something that they have to be ready to, to fight against. And so what's the opposite? What would be the opposite of a mood involving like irritability or defensiveness or a readiness to be angry? What would be like an opposite of something like that? What would be a mood that would be contradictory to that? So this mood, we'll say, a given individual doesn't have any problem with. Like this is like we'll say like their everyday way of being. There's a familiar mood to them. What would be like something that would be counter to that way of being? Okay, well, let's maybe not get into like whether they hold beliefs that are accurate or false or true or that sort of thing. But we can say that a mood of being joyful or happy could be, different from. So what is like joyful or happy feel like? Right? We often don't think about that, but feels like a lightness, like an openness, like just an elation, like a warm feeling or something like that, right? And that would be different from what this person. What would be another mood that would be counter? Yeah.
I'd just say positivity and optimism.
Positivity and optimism.
Like looking forward to something, right?
Okay.
Like if you're in a kind of grouchy mood, the opposite to that to be looking forward to something makes you more receptive, right?
Okay. So again, if we focus more on the cognitive component, we can say, well, this person sounds like a person who is cynical, sounds like a person who is lacking optimism, and then the opposite of that would be someone who, has a more hopeful approach or something to the future, to how things could go. In terms of just the mood, though, like more on a visceral level. So if someone is ready to be defensive, they're ready to do battle, they're ready to kind of see you as a threat, right? And they're ready to kind of face that. What would be the opposite of seeing the world as threatening? Yeah. Someone who's very peaceful, someone who's relaxed, someone who gives people the benefit of the doubt, someone who's arguably ready to be vulnerable in a way, right? So the opposite of being defensive is being open and being vulnerable. And an extreme version of that, not extreme, but like on the further end of that, we can say like someone who has a capacity for experiencing emotions like sadness, loneliness, right? And what's interesting is that, you can look at a predisposition to experiencing irritability and anger. The other side of that is arguably a vulnerability. If I'm angry at you for what? I'm angry at you arguably for hurting me. I'm angry at you for disrespecting me. I'm angry at you for, leaving me feeling abandoned and unimportant, right? And so we might wonder with someone who has like a disposition that is oriented toward defensiveness and anger, what is their capacity for bearing vulnerable feelings? And see, we might test that out as a hypothesis. So why do they, kind of operate in the world in this way? Well, one reason is that the mode of vulnerability does not show itself for this person. So we might test that hypothesis out. We might sort of ask questions as it relates to, it might even like, so this thing that happened, you're really angry or upset about that. So why were you angry about that? So you were angry about that because they did what? They did what to you? They left you feeling hurt. How does this feeling hurt? How does that show up? How do you experience that feeling? And just see, whether they're able to do that. One maybe kind of overly simplistic way of, thinking about personality, and you consider like, well, what is a healthy personality? One way of thinking about it is that it's an individual who is arguably open and flexible in their way of thinking, in their way of making sense of the world, interpreting the world, and they can engage in various different modes of thinking. They're open in the kinds of moods that they're capable of experiencing, right, and different sorts of emotions as the context calls for it. It's not like a rigid way of dealing with every situation with anger, for example. If the situation calls for it, they can experience a vulnerability. If the situation calls for it, they can experience anger. And whatever other kinds of emotions. And they're open and flexible because of those two things, arguably. They're open and flexible in the behavioral responses that they can then engage with. So that person is arguably like a healthy personality, emphasizing that kind of flexibility in the way that they are in the world. Does that make sense? There's this interesting take on depression that I thought I would just mention. Anthony Fernandez, who is a philosopher who is involved in that Heidegger reading group that I mentioned, he's at Kent State University in Ohio, and he wrote an interesting paper on arguing that certain forms of depression can actually be interpreted as a form of de-situatedness, so a degradation or an erosion of that existential structure of situatedness. And again, situatedness is what allows any kind of mood to show up at all. And so what he's saying is that there are certain forms of depression that is not to be interpreted as a particular problem in mood, but rather it's a degradation of some sort at the level of the existential. I'm just going to read a brief quote about this. Some cases of people diagnosed with major depressive disorder consist primarily in a degradation of the existential structure of situatedness. In these cases, the core of the disorder is not to be found in despair, guilt, or hopelessness. Rather, the disorder is an erosion of the degree to which one is situated in the world at all. And this explains in some ways why meaning is often lacking, right? So again, you need to be dialed into the world in terms of your mood and your emotion in order for anything to show up as meaningful at all, right? And so if there's a problem at the level where just moods just don't, have that visceral force, they don't seem to show up at all, it's like a wet blanket over every possible mood, the person is left in this sort of detached, kind of numb way of being, and it's very difficult, for anything to show up as meaningful at all. There's not even the painful feeling of loss, right? It's just this sort of flatlining of sorts. And these individuals are really tough to work with, right? Because, why are they even in therapy? What is the motivating force that even would compel them to seek out help or treatment? So arguably, given the choice between working with someone who has a significant level of anxiety versus someone who is depressed in this way, given the choice, it'd be much easier to work with the person who is anxious because there's some movement happening, right? And with people who are depressed in that way, you need to work with them such that you can kind of get some movement happening. And usually, once you get on that track, the first thing to show up is anxiety, and that would be a good thing. I was kind of hesitating on whether I was going to talk about this because it's such a very complicated thing, but we're going to get into it at some point anyway. Maybe we'll venture into this just a little bit here, but if you're a little bit fuzzy or lost in what I'm about to say, that's okay. But we can talk about possible differences between, or the relationship between fear and anxiety, or different kinds of fear and anxiety as it might show up. And one of the ways to venture into this conversation is we can think about, the fear response as it relates to maybe what's happening on a neurophysiological level or what it feels like in an experiential sense. And we can start with, the fight or flight response as, your body's sort of material efficient kind of response to a perceived threat in the environment. And that involves part of the sympathetic nervous system. Your pupils dilate, you get this increased blood pressure and heart rate, and there's a tension in your body, and there's a readiness to act in some way. And you can fight off a potential threat or flee if you need to. If you're fighting something off, arguably it activates the rage circuit. for Panksepp, and off you go. Now, and we experience anxiety again as this sort of labored breathing and this, elevated heart rate and this tension in our body, this uneasiness, this urge to move. Now, there's another threat response that we can contrast that with, and it's a different way that a fear response can manifest, and it's the freeze response, right? And that's part of the parasympathetic nervous system. Have you guys learned about polyvagal theory and that sort of thing in your classes? A couple nods, no? So the idea is that this is an evolutionarily older system, and it's a system that we share with all vertebrates, including bony fishes. And you can think about it in this way. If you imagine like a fish kind of moving through underwater, and it perceives a threat, it engages in this automatic fear response, which it freezes. And predators that can only detect movement will then pass by that animal. Other animals like lizards will engage in the same response, and it'll be like a death feigning, right? So the predator will not eat it, because again it's not moving, or because maybe it's poisonous or something like that. It'll leave it alone. And humans had that same response, and that same response is actually part of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is according to polyvagal theory. The vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve, and it branches off into two different sections. And one of them is this evolutionarily older system that involves a freeze response, and then another is the one that we're more familiar with that sort of complements the sympathetic nervous system activation. We call it sometimes the rest and digest response, right? But so there's this freeze response, and it manifests as experientially as like a nauseous feeling, as there's a drop in blood pressure, there's a slowing of the heart rate. If you were to look at someone from the outside, it's almost, you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell that they're in a high level of anxiety. But because there's this drop in blood pressure, a person can feel dizzy, or they can have difficulty thinking, formulating their thoughts. And again, this is one of the ways in which this can show up physiologically. And you think about this kind of evolutionarily. So first we had the freeze response, and then built atop of that we had a more adaptive response, which is the fight or flight response. Now the organism can engage in some kind of action, right? Either fight something or run away from it. And then arguably there was a system built atop that with mammals, and that's more or less our socio-emotional attachment systems, that we can engage with one another through our feelings and through negotiating more on that level. What's interesting is that, and so when these systems fail, it's like there's a failure at the top level, and then the default or more adaptive system is the sympathetic nervous system activation. If a person is in a really bad way, then they default to this freeze response. And when a person is in a freeze response, it's very difficult for them to interpret facial expressions, apparently. That's what some of the literature suggests on some of this. So they can't really tell if this person that they're engaging with is a friend or a foe, essentially, right? Or what their intention is. It's difficult to navigate that. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on maybe an experiential level. There's some important differences that we want to note there. Now, what is this difference between fear and anxiety? Well, from a psychoanalytic or an existential phenomenological frame, fear is, what happens when you're able to identify a detectable threat in the environment, right? That there's some entity or event in the world that you can, there's something that you're facing that is the cause of the experience of fear. And so examples of that, like there's a fear of a spider or a dog or heights or whatever, right? There's an actual thing in the world. And the reason why that's important is because you can engage in activities to deal with this threat, right? You can either run away from this thing, or you can grab a big stick and whack the venomous spider, or if there's a nasty dog, you can throw it a bone and distract it and run away. Like there's some thing that you can do with it, right? Now, anxiety, though, anxiety is what shows up, or this is the way of interpreting it, it shows up and you don't know what the cause is. It's almost like the anxiety seems to come out of nowhere, right? And there's no clearly adaptive action that one can take up, to deal with it. And so that's one of the important differences. And so just to give an example of that, I'll try to give the most straightforward example as I can. If you're working therapeutically with someone and someone comes in, they say, look, I've been dealing with these panic attacks, these anxiety attacks. I've been having them for 3 months, at least a couple times a day, consistently. I don't know what the hell they're about. I don't know where they're coming from. I don't have any automatic thoughts. It's just out of the blue. It's just showing up. And you ask them, okay, was there something that was happening like just prior to the onset of these panic attacks or whatever? And as far as you can tell, there's just nothing. There's absolutely nothing. But then on a deeper exploration into this person's, longer history and dynamics, and you're asking, specific questions, you come to find out that, the 3 months when the panic attack started happened to be the 1-year anniversary of the death of this person's mother. And then as a psychologist, you might be kind of wondering about that, and you sort of ask some questions. Well, what was that like for you? Like, how did you deal with this loss? And were you close with your mother? And, what was the significance of that? And who was there for you? And all these kind of questions. And when you're asking the questions, you may notice what happens, that the person starts getting really, really tense, and they start sighing. And what's interesting is that oftentimes when you ask this person, like, what's going on here? Like, what do you notice happening here as we're talking about this? And they're sort of oblivious to it. They're like, well, what do you mean? And then you say, well, do you notice that you're clutching your hands really tightly? And then they look down, and to their surprise, like they're doing that. And so you can put together a bit of a cause and effect. Like, do you think that this rise in anxiety that we just noticed here as we're talking, could that be related to this loss? I mean, it can't be just coincidence, or maybe it is, but it's highly unlikely that the timing here, this familiar time of year, it sounds like in our conversation that you hadn't really engaged with a lot of these feelings. Could this thing be connected? So anxiety, especially to the dynamically oriented psychologist, has the capacity of, or it takes on the sense of a signal, or it references something that does not show itself. So in this case, it is a signal for some unresolved grief or loss, or we might hypothesize that's what's going on here. I was going to talk about ground mood, but that's getting pretty far down the road with the existential stuff, and I just worry it would just confuse people. So if you're roughly on board, I'm happy with that. So we also want to distinguish the phenomenological approach as it relates to, again, we're curious about the first person phenomena experience, but appearance versus phenomena. So again, the phenomenological approach doesn't just take mere introspection to be the thing that you're after. It's always interpretive. It's trying to get at the truth of what is. It's bringing something into the light, into the clearing, so that it can show itself as itself. That's the genuine phenomena. And you might run into what is just mere appearance along the way to that. And so just to give an example of that, and this is kind of related to what I just mentioned with the signal anxiety stuff. If a psychologist is working in a relationship context, and you have a husband and wife, and the wife has expressed this terrible, vulnerable feeling of just feeling lonely and sad, and feeling like her partner does not care, about her and about things that are important, and it's this really awful thing, and she's tearful in expressing this feeling. And you turn to the husband and you say, look, what do you hear Susan to be saying just now, and what is this like for you? What happens for you as you sit here and you sort of engage with that? And again, what you notice perhaps is the person, there's a smile that creeps up in that question being directed in that way, and the individual gets a little bit tense and turns away. They're kind of looking at the floor. And you ask them again, well, what's going on here? And again, what is this like for you? And they say, let's say, well, it's not good. I don't want them to feel that way. Okay, so you have the thought, I don't want them to feel that way, but what's going on in your body right now? And again, they're tending more to the words and whatnot. They're not really attending to what's happening in their body. When they draw their attention to it, they are able to say, look, to be honest, I feel really uncomfortable. I feel really tense and whatnot. And so the appearance, what shows itself in the first person, is tension, anxiety. Now, is that the empathy that we're inviting this person to engage with for their partner? No, that's just what appears. So the genuine phenomenon is somewhere beneath that, arguably, right? And so we want to try to get beneath that to access whatever those genuine feelings are. And why is that? Because, in this hypothetical situation, the wife is experiencing this vulnerable feeling and she's alone in it. There's no one there to connect with her. There's no empathy coming forth. There's just this nervous energy that comes in. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me on that? So we'll talk about the history of mood and emotions that may vary across time and within various cultures, or how the structure of a community or a period can influence the different sorts of moods and emotions that show themselves. So first, just a quick breakdown. This is one offered by Dreyfus on why moods cannot be just private feelings in our heads or something like that, or in our isolated selves that are then projected onto the world. And so just quickly, cultures have long-standing sensibilities that color our moods. This is more or less what we've talked about. There's a cultural sensibility. It's a mode of situatedness that is public and is prior to mood, in that it governs the range of available moods and how the display rules and how these moods will manifest and under what contexts or situations. Moods depend on the sociocultural norms to a great extent. An interesting one to look at is, you guys are familiar with the British stiff upper lip, right? And what does that entail? What does that seem to mean? What's that?
No real reactions.
No real kind of emotional reaction. There's a kind of like emotional stoicism. There's that refrain, keep calm and carry on kind of thing. But what's interesting, so there's this inhibition as it relates to emotional expression within this British culture. But what's interesting is that apparently it hadn't always been that way. That in the mid-18th century, that emotional expression, was actually quite welcome. And so there'd be like these social gatherings and outpouring of emotion, either like joyful elation and tears of happiness, or tears of mourning and whatnot. But over time, this had changed. There are public and social moods, ways of being with one another, including shock, outrage, mourning, elation, this kind of thing. And the idea is that my mood is not essentially private. So someone in my culture could share the same mood, can intuitively understand it. Again, they're not going to experience the exact same phenomenon as you experience it, but there's going to be enough of a similarity that it has some intelligibility. Okay, so we can talk about emotions as basic to a society. Some emotions might be considered more basic because they are more important within a particular society. This need not mean the most valued or the most common. So as Solomon notes, in a warrior society, fear is not a basic emotion. That doesn't mean that they do not experience fear. It's just something that is never talked about, and it's something that is inhibited or rarely expressed. Anger is often talked about, greatly feared, and rarely experienced. So note that in addition to the above, in humans, many emotions can become hypercognized, that is, intellectualized, which affects their experience and expression. So intellectualizing means that you're able to conceptualize your emotions in sort of a detached, generalized way without having to experience as much of the feeling. So some people are really good at this. They have a high emotional vocabulary. They can use emotional words, but they're unable to experience the emotions very deeply. So we can distinguish an indefinitely large number of emotions within a cultural matrix of judgments, appraisals, matters of scope and focus, what kinds of situations call for a different emotional reaction or a mood, sentiments related to desires and plans for action, and so on. An emotion is not, for Solomon, a discrete entity, but a node in a nexus. So it's enmeshed within this web of socio-cultural practices and meanings and interpretations. Each culture may have its own emotional repertoire. It doesn't mean that they have novel emotions necessarily, but the kinds of emotions that are permissible within a given culture or community will vary. Emotions tied to the cultures within which the experiencer dwells can become arguably lost to history. So just to run through a quick example of that, in ancient Greece, they had written about this phenomenon of Acedia, which involves a kind of a listlessness, a lack of care, concern with one's position or condition in the world. The symptoms would include sleepiness, a general illness, a fever, pain in the limbs, and a weakness in the knees. It would be interpreted within that culture as the presence of a demon invading the body, which the soul could cast off through strength of will. Those who had symptoms were viewed as too weak to fight, succumbing to sin and vice. The cultural interpretation meant that the sufferer experienced a great deal of guilt and shame. In contrast, melancholia involves sadness, little enthusiasm, no inclination to be actively involved with people or things. It's derived from an ancient medical theory based on the four humors associated with bodily fluids. Melancholia was thought to be the result of excess black bile. It's viewed as an internal condition versus one caused by an external demon, in the case of Acedia, and was not judged as a shameful failure on the part of the individual. Unlike modern depression, melancholia also seemed to involve a state of expectation associated with creativity and ingenuity. Now, the point of this is that even if there are signs of Acedia, melancholia, and depression that resemble each other, the labeling, the framing, and the contextualizing of those signs are vastly different. So relating the symptoms to diverse systems of reference, including magic, religion, arts, the sciences, neurobiology, affects the value attributed to them. And this, in turn, affects the appraisal and experience of those states. Seen from this perspective, acedia and melancholia are indeed lost emotions, lost in translation to a new emotional state called depression. And again, the common interpretation of depression that seems to be kind of put out there is the idea that depression is a problem of neural dysregulation of some sort. And, what does this do in terms of the guilt and shame piece? Does it help us or does it harm us in that way? Like, does it? I think the idea is that if it's a neurological condition of some sort, if it's a neurobiological kind of imbalance or something, it's not your fault, right? It's a problem of the machinery in your nervous system. But it also, as we've talked about it, it arguably, cuts you off from an authentic interpretation that may involve, other life experiences that could explain it, and pathways towards overcoming, these issues as well. Okay. Another emotion that is arguably, we're using kind of emotions somewhat broadly here, arguably lost in history, is that of honor as an emotional disposition. So it's linked to one's self-concept, a sense of personal integrity, and aspirations to social recognition and reputation. So the idea is that one has to be willing to to defend one's honor, that one's honor could be in jeopardy by verbal insults and slights and things of that nature, and we have this duty or obligation to defend our honor, the honor of our family, or something like that. So losing one's honor due to violating those codes and or being banished from the group was tantamount to suffering social death. One's honor was defended by all means. Insults could not go unanswered without being branded a coward. It implies that one deserved the insult by not being emotionally involved and eager to protect his honor. And an extreme example of this would be the dueling phenomena in some of these honor cultures. So risking actual death to reclaim the threat of social death. Yep.
Would honor be related to pride?
I think depending on the connotation or the way of kind of looking at it. So it's certainly related to shame, right? So if you were not willing to defend your honor, if you weren't willing to fight, the integrity. So the idea that just even the integrity of your self-concept was something that could be in jeopardy in that social context. And if you didn't defend yourself or weren't willing to take a stand, then you would be left feeling ashamed, right? Which is a kind of social death. It's the way that your culture, society, other people would view you with judgment. So the idea is that honor culture as a whole has kind of waned, and it's been replaced by arguably a dignity culture. But there are pockets, there are subcultures, there are other parts of the world that still very much engage in honor culture. And even here, we have subcultures like street gangs and things like that, where it's still very much a thing. So the idea is that honor culture had sort of rescinded. It had been replaced in the Western world, especially with a dignity culture. And a dignity culture is one where the public opinion matters less. The idea is that you are a person of inherent worth, regardless of what other people say about you. There's no kind of verbal slights or things like that that could really affect your integrity as a person. And if you grow up in a strong sort of dignity culture, you kind of internalize this attitude that sticks and stones can break my bones, names can never hurt me. So there's this differentiation between physical violence and like a verbal attack or something like that. And so, and there's also this emphasis on self-restraint. So there's a kind of, a quiet stoicism, the idea that you would even kind of react, strongly to someone else's insult or attack, suggests in some way that you believe that this person has the credibility to sort of question your integrity or something. And it's like, if you grow up in a dignity culture, it's almost like it's not even worth your time. Like this person's not even worth the effort. I don't have anything I need to prove. I don't have anything I need to defend. And so the idea is that with honor cultures tend to exist where there's not as much kind of social structure and rules, like a law enforcement, that sort of thing. And so you would engage in this. So if you were to partake in this honor culture, you assert yourself aggressively. You're basically kind of holding yourself up as a force to be reckoned with, and that maybe kind of inhibits other people from attacking you or challenging you in some way. With dignity culture, there's not as much of a need for that. So, and arguably since World War II, it's been largely a dignity culture. What's interesting, though, is that there have been some arguments that this dignity culture has been undermined in recent years and is being challenged by what is now viewed as a victim culture, which sort of operates differently. And this is based on some of the work, well, at least as I've encountered it, by Campbell and Manning, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, which is pretty interesting. And in their words, they say that the status is, again, very much tied to public opinion. It rejects dignity culture's distinction between violent offenses and mere verbal ones. So they don't really seem to notice that there's a distinction there, and so it resembles honor culture in some ways. So a culture of victimhood instead handles conflicts not through asserting yourself and reckoning with an individual and taking that responsibility and dealing with it on your own, but through complaints to authorities and other third parties, while simultaneously cultivating an image of being victims that need and deserve that assistance from other people, whether those people be Twitter mobs that are going to do this pile-up type thing, or whether that be submitting complaints to various kind of bureaucratic sort of agencies operating within a corporation or a university or something like that. And so for Campbell and Manning, this sort of culture of victimhood is characterized by hypersensitivity to slights and a readiness to be outraged. So there's this readiness to feel oneself as being offended, and a readiness to be outraged and angry and to shame other people who are engaging in some unsavory behavior. So again, this structures arguably the way that we experience the world and the way that we relate to one another. One of the interesting kind of bits in this culture of victimhood is the concept of a microaggression. So a microaggression, in the words of Daryl Wing Su, is the brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, or sexual orientation and religious slights and insults to the target person or group. Now, what's interesting about that is that the intention doesn't matter. All that matters is the effect, and the effect can only be determined by how the recipient interpreted the situation, right? And so we're clumping together a number of different phenomena. And so a microaggression could include something that is arguably like a legitimate issue or concern, such as the cringeworthy, statement that someone might have that you're a testament to your race, directed toward, a racial or ethnic minority. Now that's like a pretty kind of gross thing to say, but a microaggression also includes things such as, someone asking a racial or ethnic minority, where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And again, it kind of depends on the context, doesn't it? Like, there could be a context, I think, where you could argue, well, that's an appropriate question, right? There's no mean-heartedness, let's say. Maybe there is, right? But clarifying the intent is not something like within this victimhood culture. It's not something that you would do. Microaggression, I just found out that apparently I'm guilty of the microaggression of, saying, are you guys with me? Like when I say you guys, apparently that's a microaggression against, people here who are not guys. And if someone was to be really offended by that, regardless of my intent, that's just how I talk, that's just how, but someone could file a complaint against me, and, I could find myself potentially in hot water, I'm having to defend myself, or something like that. So it's this really weird kind of slippage in how we talk about these things. But any comments or questions about any of that sort of thing?
It's too scary.
Too scary. Can't talk. Well, what's interesting? Like one of the reasons why I have the video camera here is because I just know that like, if you're trying to talk honestly and you're trying to like think out loud, like there's a chance that you might say something that can be taken out of context. And at least here there's a record where someone can look at the broader context and say, okay, is he a bigot? Is he a racist? But it's a weird sort of time that we're living in. It's very, very strange, where intention doesn't seem to matter. It's interesting when I work in a relationship context, I'm working with a couple, and someone gets into the business of labeling other people's behaviors. So they say, well, you're manipulating. I don't put up with that in a relationship context. That's not for you to say, you're going to label this other person's behavior. Take responsibility for what's happening here in this moment. Do you mean to say that you feel manipulated? Because if that's what you mean to say, no one can argue or debate that. You have every right to say that. And how about you express that and see if this other person cares? See if it matters to this person. If it does, maybe they can clarify their intent. Well, look, that wasn't my intent to do it in this way, and I'm sorry that you felt this way, and let's try to figure out how you don't have to feel that way, and I don't want to be seen as a person who manipulates others and so on. But if instead, the goal is to label other people's behavior and then infer what the intent must have been, I think we're setting like a really high standard for ourselves that is really not good, and it's going to create, I think it already has created a great deal of conflict, social conflict and anxiety about just even speaking honestly, Any other comments or questions? How many people feel the same way? How many people feel like, oh gosh, this whole conversation is like the third rail that I'm afraid to even kind of say what I think in a certain way? Can I get a show of hands?
Well, I'm not afraid, but I'm frankly, yeah.
There's some apprehension, let's say. Yeah.
I just don't want to get deported.
Hopefully that wouldn't happen. Yeah. But I don't know. Yeah. Well, hopefully, like some of this is changing a little bit. And again, like I would much prefer, like like if anyone is offended by anything that happens in here, like I think I'm a reasonable person. Like I don't want anyone to feel bad or terrible or anything like that. And if you let me know that something kind of rubs you the wrong way or whatever, like I would care, So I would hope that we could have that conversation if that ever happened to be the case. But okay, we'll wrap up there. Next class, we'll get into attachment theory.